She saved pennies for years. What her grandson did next left her speechless. She held the penny between her fingers for a long moment before dropping it into the glass jar, and the soft clink it made echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Margaret sat in her small kitchen, the late afternoon sunlight spilling across the wooden table that had seen countless family meals, birthday cakes, and cups of coffee shared with neighbors. On that table now sat the jar. It was no ordinary jar. Its sides were scratched from years of use, the lid dented from being opened and closed thousands of times. Inside, a mountain of copper shimmered like a quiet secret. To anyone else, it might look like a child's forgotten collection of loose change. To Margaret, it was the story of her life told one penny at a time. She reached for another coin. Her hands were slower now, thinner than they had been years ago. The skin showed every season she had endured, but her grip was steady. Each penny she placed inside was like a prayer whispered into the air. She remembered the first time she had started this habit. She was only a young mother then, standing in the very same kitchen, wondering how she would pay the bills. Her husband had lost his job at the factory, and food prices were rising. That was when she decided that nothing, no matter how small, would ever go to waste, not even a penny. Her children used to laugh about it. They would roll their eyes when she bent down to pick up a coin from the sidewalk. "Mom, it's just a penny," they would say. But Margaret would smile and put it in her pocket anyway. "One day, you'll understand," she would reply. And she meant it, because for her, it was never about the value of a single coin. It was about what those coins became when they were together. Now, decades later, the jar was nearly full again. She had emptied it many times in the past, always for necessities: school supplies, winter coats, groceries when money was tight. But she always returned to the ritual, because the act itself gave her a sense of control in a life that often felt unpredictable. As the jar filled, so did her memories. She remembered counting pennies with her youngest daughter at the table, teaching her how to roll them in paper sleeves for the bank. She remembered her son groaning as he carried the heavy jar to the car. She remembered her late husband shaking his head at her persistence, only to later thank her when the pennies paid for a bill they couldn't otherwise cover. In her later years, the jar became something different. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was habit, yes, but it was also hope. Each coin she dropped in was a reminder that she was still contributing, still saving for something, even if she didn't yet know what that something would be. Margaret sighed as she looked at the jar, her lips curving into a faint smile. She thought about her grandchildren and how they teased her whenever they visited. "Grandma, you and your pennies," they would say, shaking their heads with a laugh. She would let them laugh, but inside, she hoped one of them might one day see what she saw: the beauty of patience, the power of persistence. And though she didn't say it out loud, she had always dreamed that her jar might mean something more than just loose change, that maybe, one day, it could become a gift, not of money, but of meaning. That evening, as she put the lid back on the jar, Margaret whispered to herself, "It's not much, but it's mine." She didn't know that someone else in the family was paying attention. She didn't know that this simple jar of pennies, which had been her quiet companion for so many years, was about to change her life in a way she never expected. The jar sat on the table, catching the fading sunlight. To Margaret, it was another ordinary day, another penny saved. But to her grandson Daniel, watching quietly from the doorway, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. Margaret's mornings were always the same, and she liked them that way. She would rise with the first light, make herself a simple cup of tea, and sit by the window that overlooked her small yard. From there she could see the roses she had planted decades ago, still blooming faithfully every spring. Her life was quiet now, but it hadn't always been this way. Every wrinkle in her face carried the memory of years when nothing came easy. She had been born into a family that never knew wealth. Her father worked long days in the fields, and her mother did laundry for neighbors to keep food on the table. Margaret remembered as a child walking barefoot down the dirt roads, pockets empty, but always searching the ground for coins. Even then she knew the value of small things. A single penny meant a piece of candy at the corner store. A dime meant enough to buy a loaf of bread if she saved it with others. Life had taught her early that you never let go of what little you have. When she grew older and married, she carried those lessons with her. Her husband, Frank, was a hard worker, but the factory jobs paid little, and there were times when money seemed to vanish faster than it came in. The arrival of their children only added to the strain. Margaret learned how to stretch every dollar. She made clothes last longer by patching and sewing. She cooked big meals from scratch, often from ingredients grown in her garden, and she kept saving her pennies, no matter how ridiculous others thought it seemed. The children never understood. They wanted new shoes like their friends had, or toys they saw in store windows. Margaret would smile sadly and explain, "We can't always have what we want, but we'll always have what we need." That was the principle she lived by, and she proved it time and time again. When the heating bill arrived in the middle of winter and there wasn't enough to cover it, she would open her jar and roll the pennies with her children around the table. They groaned about how long it took, but when the coins paid the bill, they saw her point. Still, they teased her. They couldn't help it. "Mom, you're the only person in the world who cares this much about pennies," they would laugh. Margaret only smiled in return. She never took offense, because she knew something they didn't, that the habit wasn't just about money. It was about discipline. It was about proving to herself that small efforts, repeated daily, could change everything in the long run. As the years passed, Margaret kept her simple ways. She never bought things she didn't need. She never took on debt if she could avoid it. She lived within her means, even when others lived beyond theirs. And while her neighbors might have driven newer cars or bought larger houses, Margaret found comfort in her modest home, her garden, and her jar of pennies that steadily grew. Her friends often admired her resilience. Some even called her stubborn. But she wore the label with pride. She believed in consistency. She believed in making do with what you had. And though she never said it directly, she believed the world had forgotten how important those values were. Now, in her later years, her life was slower, but the same spirit remained. She still picked up pennies on the sidewalk, even when strangers gave her odd looks. She still checked her change at the store carefully. She still added coins to the jar every single day, no matter what. Her grandchildren rolled their eyes the way their parents once had. They grew up in a world of credit cards and online shopping, where money was digital and pennies seemed almost useless. But Margaret knew better. She knew that behind every large thing was 1,000 small beginnings. She had lived it. She had survived because of it. And though she never admitted it out loud, her heart carried a quiet dream. Perhaps one day, long after she was gone, someone in her family would understand why she had done it all. Someone would see that her jar wasn't a collection of coins. It was a collection of faith, persistence, and love. Margaret took another sip of her tea, watching the sun rise higher in the sky. Life had given her little, but she had learned to make the little mean everything. She didn't know it yet, but the lesson she had guarded all her life was about to find its way into the heart of her grandson in a way she could never have imagined. Daniel was 17 when he first really noticed the jar. It had always been there on his grandmother's kitchen table, like a piece of the furniture, but until that day, he had never given it much thought. He had come over after school, hungry as always, expecting the usual plate of cookies she somehow always had waiting for him. Instead, he found her leaning over the jar, carefully slipping in another penny. "Grandma," he said, dropping his backpack by the door, "why do you still do that? Pennies don't even buy anything anymore." Margaret glanced up, her eyes kind but firm. She tightened the lid on the jar and smiled. "Because, Daniel, even the smallest things matter. They just need time to show you how." Daniel frowned. He was a teenager, impatient and practical. The idea of saving pennies felt pointless in a world where everything cost so much more. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, the glass jar between them. It was heavier than he expected when he tapped it with his finger, the coins rattling softly. "Seriously, though," he said, "this must take forever. What are you even saving for?" Margaret's smile faded into something softer, almost wistful. "I'm saving for life, dear. For what comes when you least expect it." She leaned back in her chair and folded her hands in her lap. "You'd be surprised what these pennies have done for us over the years. They've kept the lights on. They've bought food for the table. They've even bought your mother her first winter coat when she was little. Do you think that was pointless?" Daniel shook his head, embarrassed. "No, I guess not. But still, it just feels like a lot of work for so little." "That's where you're wrong," Margaret said gently. "You see the little, but I see what it becomes. That's the difference." For a moment, Daniel didn't reply. He studied her face, noticing the wrinkles etched deep around her eyes, the way her hands rested on the table with quiet strength. He had always admired his grandmother, but in that moment, he realized there was a depth to her that he had never truly seen before. He thought about the world he lived in, fast, loud, filled with quick purchases and instant gratification. His friends talked about the newest phones, the newest sneakers, things that cost more than he could ever afford. And here was his grandmother, still faithfully saving pennies like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Doesn't it get boring?" he asked finally. Margaret laughed, a soft, warm sound. "No, Daniel. It gives me peace. Every coin I put in that jar tells me I haven't wasted what I've been given. It reminds me that no effort is too small. And when I look at it full, I see the years of care I've put into this family. That's never boring." Her words lingered with him long after she stood up to make tea. Daniel found himself staring at the jar as though it had become something more than just glass and metal. He wondered how many coins were inside, how much time they represented. He wondered if he could ever have that kind of patience. Later that night, as he walked home, Daniel kept thinking about what she had said. Even the smallest things matter. He didn't want to admit it, but it struck something deep inside him. Maybe there was a lesson here, hidden in plain sight, that he had ignored for too long. He decided then that he would pay closer attention. He didn't yet know why, but he felt certain the jar wasn't just about pennies. It was about his grandmother's story, her sacrifices, her way of seeing the world, and he felt an urge, an almost urgent need, to understand it better. That simple question, asked on a lazy afternoon, would change everything. Because Daniel was about to discover that what looked like the smallest thing in his grandmother's life would soon become the biggest lesson in his own. Margaret never spoke much about her dreams, but they lingered quietly inside her like an old melody. She had lived most of her life putting others first. Her children, her husband, even neighbors who needed help. Whenever there was a little extra money, it went toward someone else's need. New shoes for her son when his soles wore thin. A doctor's visit for her daughter when she had a bad cough. Groceries for a neighbor who had fallen on hard times. For decades, Margaret had told herself there wasn't room for dreams when survival came first. But sometimes, late at night when the house was still, she allowed herself to think about what she might have wanted. She pictured herself traveling, maybe seeing places she had only ever read about. Paris, with its glittering lights and bustling streets. The ocean in Hawaii, blue and endless. Or even something as simple as taking a train across the country to visit old friends she hadn't seen in years. These weren't things she ever spoke of. To her, they were luxuries, and luxuries were for other people. Still, her heart kept hold of one dream in particular. She had always wanted to return to the small village where she grew up. The fields, the dirt roads, the little church with the steeple. Those memories had grown sharper as the years passed. She imagined standing there again, hearing the echo of her childhood in the breeze, touching the earth that had shaped her. It wasn't a grand dream like seeing Paris, but it was hers. And every penny she saved, though meant for practical needs, carried a tiny whisper of that longing. Daniel didn't know this. To him, the jar was just an odd tradition, an old woman's way of passing time. But that afternoon, when he asked her what she was saving for, Margaret almost told him the truth. She looked at his eager young face, his wide eyes waiting for an answer, and the words trembled on her lips. She wanted to say, "I've always dreamed of going home again." But instead she said, "I'm saving for life, dear." Part of her feared that if she shared her dream, it would sound foolish. After all, how could pennies possibly take her back to the village she left as a girl? She didn't want him to think she was unrealistic or sentimental. So she kept it tucked away, where it had always been, hidden beneath layers of practicality. That evening, as she washed the dishes, she thought about the jar differently. She thought about how much she had given to others all her life, and how little she had ever done for herself. And she wondered, just for a moment, if the jar might somehow make that possible. It was unlikely, of course, but the possibility kept her heart warm. Meanwhile, Daniel was still turning her words over in his mind. He couldn't shake the way she had said them. "You'd be surprised what these pennies have done." There was something in her voice that told him the jar was more than coins. He didn't yet know what, but he could feel it. The next time he visited, he noticed how his grandmother touched the jar as though it were alive, as though it carried a piece of her inside. He saw her pause for a second before dropping in each coin, almost like she was adding a piece of her story. That night, he asked his mother about it. She laughed and told him that Grandma had always been like that. "Your grandmother believes in things lasting," she said. "Not just money, but effort. She believes nothing should ever go to waste." Daniel nodded, but in his heart, he felt it was more than that. He sensed that the jar was tied to something bigger, something she wasn't saying, and he began to wonder what it would mean if he could help her dream come true, whatever that dream was. Margaret didn't realize it, but her quiet hope was no longer hers alone. Daniel was beginning to carry it too, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. And soon, the jar of pennies would no longer be just her secret. It would become the bridge between a grandmother's hidden dream and a grandson's determination to give her more than she ever expected. Daniel couldn't shake the image of his grandmother's jar. Days passed, and still it stayed in his mind. He thought about it at school, during soccer practice, even lying awake at night. It was strange. Something so ordinary, so small, had suddenly become the most important thing he could think about. The jar wasn't just coins anymore. It was history. It was sacrifice. And it was a mystery he was determined to solve. One Saturday, he walked back to his grandmother's house. She was outside clipping roses, her hands steady despite her age. Daniel waved and hurried up the steps. When he entered the kitchen, the jar was there, waiting on the table as always. It almost seemed to greet him, the copper coins glowing faintly in the morning light. "Grandma," he asked as he pulled out a chair, "what would happen if you stopped saving pennies?" She looked up from her gardening gloves and chuckled. "Why would I stop? It's part of me now. I'll stop when the Lord decides I can't hold a coin anymore." Daniel grinned at her stubbornness, but his mind was racing. He leaned forward. "But don't you ever wonder what else you could do with them? I mean, all those years of saving, all those jars. There's probably more there than you think." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I know exactly how much it is," she said. "Every penny counts, remember? But to me, it's never been about the number. It's about the habit, the hope." Her words were gentle, but Daniel felt a spark ignite inside him. If she had spent her life pouring herself into this jar, shouldn't she see it become something more than just coins and glass? Suddenly, he wanted to do something with it. Not for himself, but for her. That night, he opened his laptop and began researching. "What can you do with pennies?" he typed into the search bar. At first, he found silly crafts, tables covered in glued-down coins, art projects, jewelry. But then he discovered stories of people who had saved jars for years, cashed them in, and realized they were worth hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. The idea grew in his mind. If his grandmother's jar held even a fraction of that, it could become something special, something she had never dared to dream of. He thought about what she loved most. He remembered the way her eyes softened when she talked about the place where she grew up. She never said much, but Daniel had noticed it in the way she described the fields and the old church. Could it be that she wanted to go back? The thought made his chest tighten. Maybe he could make it happen. The next week, Daniel started quietly putting together a plan. First, he needed to know exactly how much was in the jar. He couldn't just dump it without her noticing, so he began small. "Grandma," he said one afternoon, "why don't I help you count these? It'll make it easier for you." She smiled at the offer, not realizing what was forming in his mind. "If you want to, dear, but it takes patience." Daniel didn't mind. In fact, he welcomed it. Night after night, he sat at the kitchen table, rolling pennies into paper sleeves. His grandmother sat with him, sometimes telling stories from her past, sometimes humming quietly while she folded laundry nearby. With each coin he counted, Daniel felt closer to her. It wasn't just money he was holding. It was her life's persistence made tangible. When he finally finished, he was stunned. It wasn't just a few dollars. It was hundreds. More than enough to mean something. His heart pounded as he stacked the rolls neatly in a box. That night, lying in bed, Daniel whispered to himself, "I'm going to do this for her." He didn't know exactly how yet, but he knew the jar couldn't just sit there anymore. It was meant for something bigger. For the first time, the weight of the pennies wasn't just on the table in his grandmother's kitchen. It was on his shoulders too. And Daniel was ready to carry it. Daniel had never carried anything so heavy in his life. The box of penny rolls felt like it weighed as much as a small child, and every step toward the bank made his arms ache. But he didn't care. With each step, he felt a strange mixture of nerves and excitement. He was about to see what his grandmother's quiet saving had truly amounted to. The teller behind the counter gave him a curious look as he set the box down with a thud. "That's a lot of pennies," she said with a half smile. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Yeah, my grandma's been saving them for years. I thought it was time to see what they're really worth. The teller called another employee over, and together they began weighing, counting, and entering numbers into the machine. Daniel stood there, watching the coins disappear into the sorter, the sound of clinking metal filling the air. It went on, far longer than he expected. Finally, the teller turned back to him with wide eyes. Well, she said, sliding a printed slip across the counter, you've got quite a treasure here. Daniel picked up the paper, his heart pounding. His eyes scanned the total, and he almost dropped it in disbelief. Over $1,200. He let out a low whistle. 1,200, all from pennies? The teller chuckled. Pennies add up. Guess your grandma knew what she was doing. Daniel left the bank in a daze, the slip of paper clutched tightly in his hand. He couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't just money. It was proof of his grandmother's persistence, her patience, her belief that small things mattered. And now, it was more than that. It was opportunity. On the walk home, Daniel's mind raced. He thought about what his grandmother might want most. He remembered the softness in her voice whenever she mentioned her hometown. He thought of the way she paused, just for a moment, before speaking about her childhood. She missed it. He could feel it. And now, maybe, just maybe, he could give her that chance. The thought of surprising her filled him with energy. He began saving his own money from his part-time job at the grocery store. He skipped outings with friends, tucked away birthday cash, and even sold a few old things online. Every dollar he saved, he thought of her. He pictured her face when she realized that her jar of pennies had turned into something so much greater. Weeks passed, and Daniel quietly worked behind the scenes. He spoke with a travel agent, who was touched when he explained what he was doing. Together, they found an affordable way to make the trip happen. The total cost was more than the pennies alone, but with Daniel's contributions, it became possible. The day he held the tickets in his hand, his heart nearly burst. He imagined his grandmother sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded the way they always were, completely unaware of what was coming. That evening, he stopped by her house. Margaret was knitting on the couch, the jar sitting quietly on the table beside her as always. She looked up with a smile. "Daniel, you're here early." He sat down, trying to contain his excitement. "Grandma," he began, "do you remember how you always said the pennies were for what comes when you least expect it?" She chuckled softly. "Of course. That's why I've kept at it all these years." Daniel reached into his backpack and pulled out an envelope. He slid it across the table. "Well, Grandma, I think that day has finally come." She frowned, confused, and slowly opened the envelope. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the tickets. Her eyes scanned the words, and her breath caught. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice shaking, These are tickets home. To the village." Tears filled her eyes before she could finish the sentence. She looked at him, speechless, her lips quivering. For the first time in her life, the woman who had always had an answer for everything was utterly without words. The jar of pennies, once just a quiet habit, had become a key to her dream. And it was her grandson, the boy who once thought the pennies were worthless, who had turned them into the greatest gift of her life. Daniel couldn't stop replaying the look on his grandmother's face when she saw the tickets. It was etched into his memory, the way her hands trembled, the way her voice faltered, the way her eyes brimmed with tears that refused to fall. He had never seen her so overwhelmed, and he knew then that every late night of rolling pennies, every extra shift at the grocery store, every dollar he had tucked away had been worth it. But this was only the beginning. The tickets were more than pieces of paper. They were a promise. and Daniel intended to keep that promise. He wanted his grandmother's dream to be more than just a visit. He wanted it to be an experience she would never forget. In the days that followed, he worked in secret. When his friends asked him to hang out, he politely declined. Instead, he spent his evenings planning. He mapped out the journey with the help of the travel agent. He researched the little village where she had grown up, reading articles and digging through photographs online. He wanted to make sure everything was ready for her when she returned. One afternoon, he even called the church in her hometown. He had found the number online, and after several tries, a kind-sounding woman answered. Daniel explained who he was and why he was calling. When he mentioned his grandmother's name, the woman's voice grew warm. "Oh, yes," she said. "We remember her family. Please tell her she is always welcome here." That simple sentence made Daniel's chest swell with pride. He couldn't wait to see his grandmother's reaction when she stepped inside that old church again. Meanwhile, Margaret struggled to wrap her mind around what her grandson had done. She would sit at the kitchen table, the tickets spread out in front of her, and shake her head in disbelief. "Pennies," she would whisper to herself. "Just pennies." She had always believed in their quiet power, but she had never expected them to carry her this far. Sometimes she would look at Daniel, busy on his phone or scribbling notes in a notebook, and feel her heart ache with gratitude. She knew he was planning something. She didn't know the details, but she could see the determination in his eyes. It reminded her of herself when she was young, resilient, stubborn, unwilling to give up. Only now, that spirit lived on in him. Daniel continued to prepare. He saved every extra dollar he earned, even skipping small comforts like snacks after work. He wanted to make sure his grandmother didn't have to worry about a thing during the trip. If she needed transportation, he'd handle it. If she wanted souvenirs, he'd cover it. He wanted her to simply enjoy every moment. As the departure date drew closer, the house began to feel alive with anticipation. Margaret polished her old suitcase, the same one she had used decades ago when she first left the village. She carefully folded her clothes, smoothing out wrinkles with her hands. She packed a small photo album, filled with pictures of her children and grandchildren, determined to show her old friends the life she had built. Daniel watched her pack, and though he smiled, he also felt a deep weight of responsibility. This wasn't just a trip. It was a journey back in time for her, a chance to reconnect with who she had been before life had pulled her in so many different directions. He wanted it to be perfect, because she deserved nothing less. The night before they left, Margaret sat by the jar, her hand resting on the cool glass. It was empty now. The pennies rolled, counted, and exchanged. But to her, it was more full than it had ever been. "You gave me more than I ever imagined," she whispered, as if the jar could hear her. Daniel overheard her and stepped into the kitchen. "No, Grandma," he said softly. "You gave me more. You taught me patience. You taught me persistence. I just gave it back to you." Margaret reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. For the first time in a long time, she felt the future opening before her, brighter than she ever thought possible. And it all began with a boy who had once thought pennies were worthless, but now understood they were priceless. The journey hadn't even begun, and already Margaret's heart was full. The plane ride felt unreal to Margaret. She pressed her hand gently against the window as the ground below grew smaller and smaller, her heart thudding in her chest. She had never imagined she would fly again, let alone toward the place where her story began. Daniel sat beside her, grinning like a child on Christmas morning, excited to watch her reaction with every new step. "Are you nervous?" he asked. Margaret gave a small laugh, though her voice shook. "Nervous?" Yes. Excited? Even more. She squeezed his hand, and he could feel how much the moment meant to her. Hours later, as the plane touched down and they gathered their bags, Margaret's eyes filled with tears before they even left the airport. The language, the smell of the food, the sound of voices. It was all familiar in a way that made her feel like she had stepped back in time. Daniel helped her into a taxi, and as they drove through winding roads, Margaret leaned close to the window, hardly blinking. Fields stretched wide, just as she remembered. The little houses with their red roofs dotted the landscape, and then, finally, the church came into view, its steeple tall and steady, exactly as she had pictured all these years. She gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. "It's still here," she whispered. "After all this time." Daniel's chest tightened at the sound of her voice. He had never heard her speak with such raw emotion. When they arrived in the village, people noticed them immediately. A few older women paused their conversations, their eyes squinting as they studied Margaret. Then, one of them broke into a smile. "Margaret?" the woman called in disbelief. Margaret froze for a moment, then nodded, tears spilling over. The two women hurried forward, embracing her tightly. "You came back!" one of them said, her voice trembling. Daniel stood nearby, watching as his grandmother was surrounded by faces that lit up with recognition. Some hugged her, some clasped her hands, and some simply smiled through their own tears. It was as if time had folded in on itself, erasing the years that had kept them apart. Margaret turned to Daniel, her cheeks wet and glowing. She couldn't speak at first, but the look in her eyes said everything. She was home. Over the next few days, Daniel witnessed something extraordinary. His grandmother walked the roads she had once run down as a barefoot child. She stepped into the church, her fingers brushing the worn wood of the pews, her eyes lifting to the stained glass windows. She visited the old schoolhouse and the small shop where her father used to buy flour. Every corner of the village carried a memory, and she seemed to drink them in as though they were water to a soul long thirsty. The villagers welcomed her with open arms, sharing stories of her family, remembering moments she herself had almost forgotten. She laughed, she cried, she sang old songs with them late into the night. Daniel sat among them, quiet but proud, knowing that he had been the one to make this reunion possible. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and painted the sky gold, Margaret and Daniel sat on a bench outside the church. She turned to him, her hands clasped together tightly. "Daniel," she said softly, "I don't know how to thank you. You've given me something I thought I had lost forever. You took what I thought was small, what I thought was nothing, and turned it into everything." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "You gave me the lesson, Grandma. I just followed it. You always told me the smallest things matter. I guess now I finally believe you." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the sounds of the village wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Margaret's heart felt lighter than it had in years. She had saved pennies for a lifetime, but it was her grandson who had shown her what they were truly worth. She looked at him, her voice almost a whisper. "I'm speechless, Daniel. Truly speechless." And she meant it. For a woman who had spent her life carefully choosing her words, she could find none big enough to match the gift he had given her. Margaret stood at the doorway of her little home weeks later, the empty penny jar resting on the table where it always had been. Only now, when she looked at it, she didn't see coins at all. She saw her grandson's smile at the airport. She saw the church steeple rising over the fields of her childhood. She saw the tearful faces of friends who had embraced her, as though no time had passed. That jar had carried her further than she ever believed possible. Daniel walked in with his usual burst of energy, dropping his backpack by the door. "Hey, Grandma," he said, grinning. "How's my favorite world traveler?" She chuckled, wiping her hands on her apron. "World traveler? Oh, I only went home, but thanks to you it felt like the whole world." He sat down at the table, his eyes drifting to the jar. "You know," he said, "I used to think that thing was kind of silly. All those years, all those pennies. I didn't get it. But now, I think it's the smartest thing anyone's ever done." Margaret lowered herself into the chair across from him, her eyes soft. "It wasn't the pennies, Daniel. Not really. It was the patience, the belief that every small act matters. That's what I wanted to teach your mother, and that's what I want you to carry with you." Daniel nodded. He wasn't a boy who liked to admit when he was wrong, but in this case, he was glad to. "I get it now. You turned pennies into lessons, and I guess I finally learned mine." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "The greatest wealth we can leave behind isn't money. It's love. It's faith. It's the example of how to keep going when life gets hard. You gave me back my dream, Daniel. But more than that, you showed me that what I've tried to live all these years, it reached you." For once, Daniel didn't joke or shrug it off. He simply squeezed her hand. "It did, Grandma. I'll never forget it." They sat there for a long moment, the jar between them like a silent witness. It no longer needed to be filled. It had already done its job. What had begun as a symbol of struggle had become a legacy, one that would live on in Daniel long after the last penny was spent. Later that evening, Margaret placed the jar back on the shelf. She didn't plan to fill it again. Instead, she let it remain empty, a reminder that small beginnings could lead to unimaginable endings. Whenever she looked at it, she would remember not just the years of saving, but the gift her grandson had given her, the chance to go home one last time. And Daniel, each time he visited, would glance at the jar and feel a quiet pride. He had once dismissed it, but now he understood that the greatest treasures in life are often hidden in places we overlook. His grandmother's pennies had taught him that. In the end, Margaret was right. Even the smallest things matter. They add up, they grow, and if you're patient enough, they can change everything. Her grandson had proved it, and that truth would stay with him forever. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.